Hi, my name is Mari Aviles, and I work as an arborist in Indianapolis. I've worked with Students Learning Center in the past, and I'm extremely excited to continue working with DLC, and I'm excited to provide content for this symposium. So today we're going to go on a little bit of a hike to see what kind of trees we find around here, and I will make sure that all of the trees that we talk about today are trees that you can find in Northwest Indiana. Northwest Indiana has such a big variety of trees, quite a big diversity. And so what we're going to do is we're going to focus on that diversity and try to point out as many trees as possible in the short amount of time that we have. So we'll talk a little bit about trees, we'll talk about their identification, and then we'll also talk about things related to the wildlife that they benefit, but also uses that humans benefit from. Okay, so I'm going to show you these 3 items that I think are extremely important to bring with me when I go hiking, especially in the spring. So depending on how long your hike is, you might bring a few extra things, but these are the things that I'm bringing with me today. So I've got my water bottle to make sure that I stay nice and hydrated. I've got my binoculars because it is spring migration season and I want to make sure that I don't miss any of the birds. And then I've also got my handy dandy tree guidebook that is one of my favorites. This is called Native Trees of the Midwest, written by a lot of professors who worked at Purdue University. And it's just really great because it's got a lot of photos and really great information about all of the trees that we are identifying today. So I just ran into some people on the trail who pointed out some cool snakes. Looks like we've got a couple of... So I just ran into some people on the trail who pointed out some cool snakes. Looks like we've got a couple of black racers sunning themselves. So today we're probably going to run into a few different wildlife. And it's super exciting to be able to see the woods coming to life right now. So if we see anything more, I'll make sure to point it out. All the way up in the trees. So, quick edit. In the previous snap, I said that we ran into some black racers, but in fact we ran into some black rat snakes. These 2 snakes are pretty similar in appearance and in size, but one of the easy ways to tell them apart is by looking at the scales. So you have to get really close and personal, but luckily I had my camera and I got to zoom in and get a good picture. So I'll show that in the next snap. But let's get back to the show. All right, so let's get started with trees. The first one we're going to point out is this Ohio buckeye. This Ohio buckeye is really easy to distinguish from other trees because it has this opposite branching, which means that at every node or every point where leaves come off of the tree, you have 2 leaves coming off at one point. And so this is called an opposite tree. So you have leaves coming out at opposite ends on the same node. And this leaf also has a palmately compound leaf, which means that this whole thing right here is a leaf. And these little things, these little blades, are called leaflets. And every buckeye will have 5 leaflets that are in the shape of a palm or a hand. So the next tree we're going to talk about is this white ash. This tree is dead, but I want to point it out for an important reason. So this is what it would generally look like if it were still alive on the bark. But this is what it looks like on the backside where the bark is pretty much peeled away. You can see this pattern going up and down the wood under the bark. And this is what happens when an ash tree gets infected or impacted by the emerald ash borer. The beetle lays its egg under the bark, and then the larva, once it hatches, eats all of the water transporting cells that the tree needs to be able to transport water from the roots all the way up to the leaves. And so this tree essentially died by not being able to get water up to its leaves. It's kind of like if you were to cut a straw at a bunch of different places, you wouldn't be able to get water to drink. Something else I want to point out is that the emerald ash borer is an invasive species, and an invasive species is an organism, either a plant or an animal, that was introduced to an area and it has caused so much damage. And in the case of the emerald ash borer, it was introduced accidentally and it caused a lot of damage in terms of our native ash population. And so invasive species usually don't encounter any control measures, usually in the form of predators in an area where they were not normally found. And so what happens is this invasive species becomes hard to control, and then we get the situation in which we've lost a lot of a single species or family of tree. Something else I want to point out is that having dead trees in our forests is an extremely important resource because it provides shelter for a lot of different species of birds, mammals, snakes, and when those trees fall on the ground, those nutrients from that tree get recycled and used up again by other plants and animals, keeping that kind of food web alive. All right, so our next tree is, if you can guess it, a sugar maple. And so this tree is pretty distinctive by its leaf shape, but it's also interesting to know that these are opposite growing trees as well, just like our buckeye was. And these are really cool because they provide maple syrup. And so just a fun fact, it takes about 50 trees to produce 1 gallon of maple syrup. So let's try our hardest to conserve these maples so we can get some maple syrup. So here we've got another 3 young sugar maples. And something to note is that its seeds are an important source of food for a lot of our wildlife. And also the sap that we use, that we extract from the tree to produce maple syrup, is also a delicious treat for animals if they find some sort of opening where they can find that sap. Also, we usually only extract that sap in the winter because the trees themselves need below freezing nights and above freezing days. They need that pattern in order to get the sap to flow. And so if they don't have that, the sap doesn't flow. And so we can probably guess that climate change might have an effect on maple sap production. And there are a lot of studies going on right now to really determine how climate change is affecting them. All right, since we are talking about maples, we'll move on to talking about silver maple. And so this one looks very similar to our sugar maple, except that when these leaves get bigger, and this is a good example right here, the sinuses or the little indents between each of these lobes right here, these little valleys, those are a lot deeper than they are in our sugar maples. So that's a really good way to tell them apart. And then this is what the bark also looks like on a silver maple. And so these silver maples and sugar maples are some that are common. Okay, so the next tree we're going to talk about is this giant cottonwood over here and over here. So these trees are usually associated with very wet areas, and in this park we mostly find them down here. We've got a barred owl flying, which is really great. Landed right over there. Nice. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But these cottonwoods are really big, and they grow really big really fast. And just so you guys get kind of like a good size description, this is my hand next to the giant ridges that the bark has, and then it's got really deep fissures as well in between each of those ridges, so it's really cool. All right, so it looks like the barred owl flew away, so we won't be able to get an up-close picture, but that's okay. I might even share one later and just like insert it. And just to point out, the cottonwood leaves look kind of like spades. They're shaped kind of triangularly. Their Latin name is Populus deltoides, and that species name they probably get from the shape of this. Alright, so another tree I want to point out that is closely associated with our cottonwoods is this sycamore. So sycamores are really easy to tell or distinguish because they've got this nice bark at the base, nice brown, somewhat peely bark, but where it really starts to peel is towards the middle. And then once you get to the very top, that bark turns white, or we've lost a lot of that peely bark and we're left with the white underneath. So these are really easy to tell apart from far away. The sycamore is another tree that grows really fast, and it's one of our larger diameter trees in the Midwest. Alright, so I found a fun tree to identify. Its leaves are pretty cool. They've got this nice serrated or like sawtoothed edge here, and they're also kind of rough to the touch. And they're shaped kind of egg-shaped, but also the bark is super spongy when it's young, so it's easy to tell apart by just kind of giving a little poke at the bark. Elm trees are really great trees, and they were known to be great street trees a long time ago, but we don't really find them very often anymore because of the Dutch elm disease, which is a disease that came through and wiped a lot of them out. But they are a great tree to find, and they provide great shelter for a lot of our wildlife. So I just ran across this nice young sycamore that's a little bit easier to see that difference in the peeling bark. Okay, so now we're up high. We were just down there, and it's important when identifying trees or animals to understand that certain species prefer certain types of ecosystems or habitats. And so some of the trees that we found down in the wetland area, we probably won't find up here where it's a little bit more dry, and vice versa. So we're going to continue on with this beautiful tree right here. So this tree is a great symbol of spring. This tree is called an eastern redbud, and its flowers are extremely beautiful. They're these light pink flowers that come out in kind of like clusters, and so they're one of the first signs of spring. These trees also have heart-shaped leaves, which make it very distinctive, and they also have bean pods, which is how they produce their seeds. So now we've come to the black cherry tree. So this tree is really easy to distinguish because its bark appears like it's got burnt potato chips. So it's got these little flakes here that are easy to peel off, but they resemble potato chips that have been burnt. And this tree specifically has some vines on it. Some of them might be Virginia creeper, others might be poison ivy. So it's important that when you see a vine on a tree, not to touch it if you don't know what it is. Be especially careful when you're leaning against a tree or something like that to make sure that you're being careful. The black cherry produces berries that are extremely tasty and beneficial to a lot of wildlife, including birds and mammals. Right, so we have two large trees here, and by large I mean tall. So here we've got two tulip trees, or tulip poplars, that are the state tree of Indiana. And so these trees are really easy to distinguish by the bark. If you remember that they got interlacing bark, so they look like they're kind of lacy from the bottom all the way to the top. They also grow very tall and very straight with very few branches along the trunk until we get towards the top. And what is really distinct about this tree is that in the spring, a little bit later, it produces beautiful tulip-shaped flowers. But the most distinctive thing is their leaves. And so this one is very small still, but as they continue to grow, they will continue to have this shape. And so an easy way to remember these tulip trees is that they look kind of like a t-shirt when you hold them upside down, but they also look like the shape of a cat's head if you hold them right side up. These are the whiskers and the ears. So here we've got a black walnut the bark itself looks similar to that of the cottonwood, but the walnut's bark looks a little bit more blocky, is pretty dark brown, and if you peel away at some of the bark, you have a nice like coffee stain brown underneath. And black walnuts are grown on plantations for that black walnut production, but these trees also produce a chemical called juglone that kind of inhibits or limits the growth of some of the plants growing underneath it, and that's called allelopathy. So here we've got a nice big white oak that's got its distinctive peeling bark that peels from the side. You can see kind of right up here. And then as you go further up on the branches, you can see a little bit more of that peeling. Kind of hard to show right now. But oaks produce the very well-known acorns. This is a terrible example of a white oak acorn. This is not really what they look like, but just to get a general idea, oaks produce acorns, and acorns are really sought out for by a lot of wildlife, and it's actually been studied that a lot of squirrels and rodents actually prefer white oak acorns over a lot of the other ones, so got a lot of picky eaters out there. I've also got a terrible example of what a white oak leaf might look like. I do have an example though of a red oak leaf that's got its lobes, which is kind of like the finger portions of the leaves, and the sinuses, which are these valleys right here. And if we were to compare the red oak to the white oak has more rounded lobes, as you can see, whereas the red oak is a little bit more pointed. And as we talk about oaks, there are two big families of oaks that are pretty important, and a lot of the oaks that we have on our list are split between those two groups based on DNA, but also a lot of distinctive features on the trees themselves. On the hunt for some red oaks so we can distinguish them from the white oaks. Found a red oak. So as you can see, this bark looks quite a bit different from the white oak. And as you go up the trunk, you get some like shiny, silvery tracks. And people say that they kind of resemble ski tracks or like tire tracks in the snow. So that's a really good way to remember to look for this distinct characteristic on the red oak. So here we've got a gnarly looking tree, not just because of all the vines growing on it, but because of this kind of warty bark. This tree is very distinct from the bark, This is a hackberry that if you look at your guidebook, it's been kind of difficult to group this into a family. It's kind of a funky tree. But yeah, it's really characteristic from the warty bark, but also later in the spring and in the summer when it's got the leaves. A lot of times these trees are the ones that got those galls on the bottom side of the leaves. Hi, it's my face again. So this is the end of our virtual tree hike tour. I hope that you all had a lot of fun watching, hopefully, as I did being out there recording all of it. So I hope that you all learned at least one new thing from this, and I hope that it's motivation to get out and identify some trees, if not at a park, somewhere in your neighborhood, just as an excuse to get outside. I want to thank Dunes Learning Center for allowing me to participate in this event, and thank you for this assignment, which was extremely fun. I'm wishing everybody the best. Take care.